Welcome back to the Cycle World Podcast. I'm Mark Hoyer. I'm the editor-in-chief. Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Cameron, technical editor, is here yet again. We're happy to say. Today's topic, is this near and dear to my heart? It is. I owned one. It was the first motorcycle I bought new. It's the Honda Interceptor in the VFR. So it's the V4s. And, foundationally, Kevin will certainly let us know the handling was really the step for that bike in the early 80s, 82, 83. Kind of changed the game. What I like about Kevin's notes, however, is that they start in 1902 Levasseurs V4 as ever. Let's get back to it. So kick us off, Kevin.
Well, the big question is, why would a major corporation want to suddenly begin backing liquid-cooled V4s after having made almost exclusively air-cooled inlines? And part of the story relates to Honda's position in the period when they were putting all their effort into developing their automotive line. That began when the classic era in Grand Prix racing, 1959 to 1967, came to an end. Honda had been planning four-wheeled products ever since 1954 or thereabouts, but it had sucked up all the engineering talent into the car division. The motorcycle racing was over for the moment. And while this was happening, Yamaha, as will happen in business, saw an opportunity. Honda is busy elsewhere. Let's take the market. So they got busy trying to do that. And at a point, Honda management saw that this wasn't going to do it all. We're not going to just sit here and let you people take the market that we created, which arguably Honda did. They became the world's largest producer in the early 60s and stayed that way for a long time. So in order to reassert
I guess the technical big bike performance market really was, for mass market, was CB750, as you're basically pointing out. And that was, wildly successful and a dominant flag in the ground. Like, here we are.
Yes.
And it took a while for everybody else to kind of catch up. Suzuki was doing rotaries and stuff, and
unbelievable, yeah.
And even Yamaha in the 70s, with their shaft drive 1100 triples and
they were motorcycles that were neither here nor there. They had very little identifiable character, but they made a lot of them. And let's bear in mind that the lesson that identity is central to motorcycle sales is forgotten over and over again and then rediscovered. And Harley Davidson were ready to produce the Nova, imagining they were going to compete with Japan. And their ad agency said, "Oh, guys, look, you've got something that no one else can ever have. You're American right back to the beginning. You're the nationalist motorcycle here in the USA." And they, "Oh yeah, that's right. Let's push that." And they pushed it wonderfully. But Honda needed to make some big statements in the market, such as the Shoichiro Irimagiri's CBX Inline 6, which of course was a production ideation of the of the six-cylinder 250, on which Mike Hillwood won two 250 World Championships, 1966 and 67. Taking
Magnificent.
taking the title from Phil Reed, who'd had it for 2 years previous on an air-cooled Yamaha. So Honda, I think, impressed themselves as much as they impressed the rest of us. Oh,
Well,
we're so big. We could do anything. And they put their shoulders to the wheel to recover and to reassert their preeminence. And one of the things that they decided they must do is to re-enter Grand Prix racing. And they were going to do it, by golly, with a four-stroke engine. Now, Mr. Iramadri, waiting at a traffic light, supposedly had the inspiration that an oval piston could provide even more valve area than the most extremely over square bore and stroke dimensions. So this concept was adopted, but because the piston was long this way and short this way, it would have been pretty difficult to make an inline four with oval pistons, because the original was something like 94.3 millimeters wide, whereas a round piston of the same area would have been 66 millimeters. So you've got 30 millimeters on each of four holes added to the width. So, all right, what about a V4? V4s had been done before, but not in motorcycling to any notable extent. I believe Ducati built a monstrous V4 that might have been aimed at the U.S. police market. I don't know. But it went nowhere. So also, Mr. Iramadri had the example of the great Grand Prix bikes, some of which he designed. And he knew that in the last year, 1967, the 500cc RC181 had some crank slippage, pressed joints, slipping. Bad effect. And in developing the oval piston NR500 as a V4, they became familiar with, had their noses or entire faces rubbed in, the fact that a very short crankshaft is more stable at high RPM than a longer one. That's why all the, from 1900 to 1910, the Grand Prix automobiles had four cylinders. Rarely were six cylinders tried because it had awful torsional oscillations. So this is one of the things that I believe that Mr. Iramadri noticed about the V4 was that it was inherently more suited to high RPM from the standpoint of crankshaft durability, because the crankshaft was short, just as the four-cylinder crankshafts in auto racing before 1910 were only 2/3 the length of a six. So this would be an important thing. Now, the NR500 was the source of many innovations which would later be seen in production, such as the upside-down fork, side radiators, many other innovations of that kind would be brought forth. Oh, we could use this. Lots of VFRs were made with side radiators. So the NR500 was regarded within Honda as being, oh, well, it was not successful in racing, but it was successful in innovation, in that it forced them to look at the V4 concept from all directions. So they said V4 is more like a ball than it is like an inline 4, which is like a suitcase. So the ball-like engine is able to be rotated in any direction with less resistance to that rotation because its radius is small. On the other hand, any V engine is longer this way than an inline engine. So it was easier to make an inline engine located far forward in the chassis resist wheelies and thus accelerate faster than in the case of the V4, which had to be sort of in the center of the chassis and couldn't go up against the front wheel and concentrate mass there. And of course, Honda management wanted to do something definitively different for their, I'm going to give you a black eye, Yamaha. And the V4 was the chosen concept. Now, I've tried to find out where that decision may have been made, and I have failed to find out what that was, who said what to whom, in which room. But in any case, an engineer, Isao Yamanaka, was charged with being the large project leader for the initial V4 engines. And it had to be water cooled because you cannot cool the second row of a 2-row engine with hot air coming off of the cooling fins of the front cylinders. That doesn't work. AJS tried that in 1935-36 with their little V4, 500 cc's, and they had to reduce the compression ratio on the rear cylinders to keep it from detonating as a result of being, in quotes, cooled with hot air. So eventually that engine, a Burt Collier design, was redesigned for liquid cooling. Honda had the advantage of beginning with liquid cooling. No messing about with fins and lowered compression and all the other problems that AJS had. So the first V4s into the production came out in 82. Simultaneously in 82, in the spring of the year, they brought the V4 1000cc FWS 1000. And it made just short of 150 horsepower, and it was very fast. It also tore up tires. And one of the innovations that came out of that particular thing was the idea of changing tires at Daytona, which has happened ever since. But that particular Daytona race, 1982, was won by Graham Crosby riding an OW31 Yamaha, 0W31, pardon me, built out of the parts room. Now, that was a motorcycle designed to win Daytona, so it's no surprise that it did well. Honda was stopped by tire trouble. They had two excellent riders, Freddie Spencer and Mike Baldwin, who made life hard for the scorers because, oh, he's in the pits. No, he's running again. Now, which lap was that? But in the end, the V4 concept was made viable in a big way in 1983 by Honda's Interceptor 750, which had a steel square tube chassis of unparalleled rigidity, even though it was a conventional twin loop design. And its considerable weight was emphasized by fabricator Todd Schuster stepping into a bare frame and pulling it up like a pair of pants while commenting that this is the second heaviest frame in all of racing, the heaviest being the 1953 Hudson. So despite its weight of over 500 pounds, this thing dominated U.S. Superbike. I think it won 5 championships. And in the form of RC30, also a V4, 750, it won the first 2 championships in World Superbike. And it did so as a result of its strong acceleration. Ducati at the time were playing with what could be called Cosworth valve timings. Lots of duration, which makes power on top, but kills the mid-range in the bottom. So while the Ducati fellows were trying to ride corner speed, so they didn't have to accelerate as much, the RC30s were winning a couple of championships based on good acceleration. Now, that's not a result of a V4 engine. It's the result of designing an engine that has good mid-range and for strong acceleration. The cylinder doesn't know where the other cylinders are. It's doing its thing. And if it's filling itself well in the mid-range, you're going to have good acceleration. So
I think it's kind of the important galactic point is that everyone says torquey American V twins. Well, it's a result of tuning. It's a result of bore and stroke. It has,
yes.
Like you can make it, as Ducati has done, you can make V twins rev very high and make no torque or very, very little. It's all about the cylinder breathing in the valve area and, American V twins.
There still are people who argue that a long stroke by itself means lots of torque. Well, what a long stroke generally means is a small bore. And a small bore means small valves, which have their peak flow in the mid-range and not on top. This gives us the shed roof torque curve, which Harley 2-valve engines for so many years had. Lots of torque at the bottom and then a slow decline until around 5,000 RPM. It's
yeah, and you can only make up for that with so much lift.
Yeah.
Right.
Take the valves out.
Theoretically, you could say, oh, let's give it 2 inches of lift instead of a half inch of lift. 2 inches of lift, but the hole is only so big, and
the hole is only so big.
And
so that's why long strokes have small bores, and their torque comes from those small valves and small ports, which you can give to any engine. So in 2020, I was invited to go on a deluxe trip to Honda in Japan, and which I enjoyed very much. And at one point, the question was put to then development director Tetsuhiro Wakabayashi, why are you building Fireblade as an inline 4 when you're racing a V4 in MotoGP? So he said, very good question. But he said, sales are not so great now. I would like to have both V4 and inline 4, but now we can only afford one. So the V4 can be looked at as having a career that peaked quite early, and which then and later encountered, both from Honda and from other manufacturers, competing sport bikes that made it difficult for the quite heavy VFR to compete nose to nose. And so VFR was gradually pushed towards the role of the gentleman's express. a motorcycle with a strong sporting performance, but a normal riding position and some tour capabilities.
And it crushed, by the way. It was, I mean, what a magnificent motorcycle. It picked up gear-driven cams, which we all at the time were dying for.
Oh, love the
Just,
whine. Yes.
it just sounded, you know, it sounded like the future. It sounded like performance, because it was performance. It gave you advantages. It had a beautiful precision to it. None of this, you know,
flapping chains,
flapping
stretching.
chains. I mean, and the complexity of just building a V4 costs you more money. You got 2-cylinder heads. You have to drive
2
4
cam
cams.
drives. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's just extra complication, which Honda was not afraid of. There was a beautiful time at Honda where it seemed like, how can we think of a more complex solution for this simple problem? You know, it was awesome. I bought a 1995 VFR. Was that a Gen 4? Brand new. That was the first motorcycle I bought brand new. I kind of wanted a 900 SS Ducati just because they were highly lauded by everyone, magazines. So it just, I made the sort of semi-rational choice of buying the Honda because I wasn't afraid of its valve gear so much. Although working on carburetors on a V4 was, you know, they're stuffed in the middle there. It's a little
getting all 4 into those rubber. Yes.
But yeah, what a motorcycle kind of dynasty. It's won, the VFR won many 10 best bikes awards for its balance of performance and smoothness. And you know, the first time I had to change tires on my VFR, so you had a single-sided swing arm. It was it was inspired by RC30. I couldn't afford an RC30, and would I want to daily ride an RC30 was the other question, even if I could afford it. But the VFR took care of all that. It was very plush. It was very comfortable. I wore the tires out. I went to change the tires, single-sided swing arm, pop it on a center stand, 4 lug nuts, roll the wheel out. But you need to kind of take the exhaust off to get the wheel. So it just unbolts, big flange. And I was standing there and I was like, I wonder how this sounds without the muffler on it. And you know what? It sounds freaking awesome. It was so good. I lit it up in the parking garage at Cycle News where I was working at the time, and I revved the daylights out of it. And
it was clearly audible.
All the other editors came down and said, "What is this wonderful sound?" It was good. But a real dynasty for that. And that trip in 2020 you did, that was a tour of HRC. Not only did you get access to the people, you got to see the shop. Everybody was out doing HRC
they were
things
in Southeast Asia doing testing. But it was just a long room with a lot of lifts, just like a repair shop. And you could imagine technicians wheeling engines in on little carts, and people
wondering where the 10mm socket is.
Yeah, right. Just like people.
Yeah.
Just like people. So one of the highlights of that trip for me was a definitive reasoning in favor of the V4 as a race engine, because at that time, everyone but Yamaha had adopted the V4 in MotoGP. And the LPL on that 2020 Fireblade was Yuzuru Ishikawa. And he told me straight out, he said, "I am an inline guy. I like inline engines." And he said, inline is ideal for World Superbike. The Fireblade was sort of a homologation special for that class. And he said their rev limits are all below 16,000. And the inline crankshaft is stable up to 16,000. But above that, it needs help. It needs crankshaft dampers. It may need dampers to control the motions of the cam drives. Anyway, he said the V4 crankshaft, being as short as it is, has 3 main bearings, 2 crank pins, where the Inline 4 has 5 main bearings and 4 crank pins. But the V4 crankshaft is stable to 18,000. And Honda have lots of experience in stabilizing crankshafts in Formula One engines. You can be sure the other Formula One constructors have similar experience. But what's happening at very high speed in those racing engines, and by high speed I mean 20,000, is that the parts have so much energy in their motion that they can so easily destroy themselves. The frequencies of parts become the most interesting thing about them, not how much they weigh or the diameters or the bearing clearances, but their vibratory modes. And this is starting to be the case with racing tires. They don't just chatter where the whole tread band moves back and forth, but they're able to do strange, sinuous motions. And I'd like to know more about that, but I can't. But for sure, the short crankshaft of the V4 engines is a real advantage. And
what is it going to do? It's going to move the frequency higher, right?
yes.
Because, if we look at
short and stiff.
Yeah, a torsional spring, like a torsion bar front suspension, like on a 1964E type coupe, you have a long bar and it's flexible. And if you make the bar the same diameter, the same material, you make it longer, it'll have more flexibility and it'll tend to displace more. So inline 6 camshafts, again, using Jaguar as a reference, or Aston Martin, these great big long camshafts. And on an Aston Martin, like the DB engine, DB4 3.7 liter aluminum block, the distributor's on the tail end of one of the cams. I think it's the intake cam. And so the drive is like 3 feet away through a really long torsional spring.
Yep.
And you would definitely end up struggling with spark scatter if you were really trying to rev the daylights out of it, because that long camshaft and the long crankshaft, that was a 7 main engine. And, it's not going to be as stable as a stubby little crank in a V4.
And the extreme in the case of a torsion bar is an oil drill string. You've got 2.5 miles of pipe down into the hole. On the bottom end is Hughes Tool Company's finest set of teeth for chewing rock. And if that bit jams, the top of the drill string may rotate 10 or 15 times before they put on the brakes and realize that we've got a jam, because that's a really long torsion bar and it's quite torsionally flexible. Whereas the V4 crankshaft is short and it has a lot of torsional stability, so that it has to be spinning faster to get excited in destructive ways.
Strictly speaking, a coil spring is a torsion bar that's been coiled up.
Yep.
So if we think about it long enough, which I think we have, I think we have, Kevin.
We have, yes. So RC30, supposedly Udo Giedel, who was running things at Honda's race team for a while in the U.S.,
saying finally, thank God that I don't have to work with the 50-mile flat twin anymore with the cases that are breathing. Watch the podcast we did on Udo's Superbike R90S. Huffing and puffing. And
the AMA was, of course, still had their feet in the Class C pass, which meant you will ride your production bike to the track, remove the headlight and taillight, and race. And as with every book of laws that has been written by the human hand, the moment it publishes, people start saying, yeah, but, well, what if we. So much for law. It's RC30 had a chassis of its time. The steering head was incredibly rigidly braced, and that bike had a reputation for no front end feel, which is characteristic of a very stiff chassis. But they developed that engine beginning at a point where it came on the torque at 7,500. They kept souping it up, more valve lift, more of everything, until the engine was coming on the torque curve at 10,500. And then they said, we need a necessary new engine because this one has reached its peak and is obsolete. There was no place to go, and it had become very hard to ride. So RC45 came along. Not everyone could ride it. Miguel de Amel was one of them. And John Kosinski won a single World Supers title on it in 97. But what happened next? Honda's looking around at all these Ducati championship wins in World Superbike. And Ducatis are invading the US Superbike. Maybe we should be building V-twins now. Those are looking pretty good. So RC51 was built. The V-twin 1000cc Honda Superbike, on which Colin Edwards Jr. won 2 Supers championships.
Yeah, at Monza in 2000, I went to Monza. It was when Troy Bayliss got kicked up on the Ducati team. He was plucked out of Anson Hines because Carl Fogarty had broken his humerus. And David Tardazzi, we pray to God to heal the bone, is what he said in the paddock to me about Foggy. And I don't know how much David Tardazzi prayed for that after watching Bayliss do what he did on that Ducati.
Yeah.
They just recently, World Superbike just recently showed that video of him passing 4 guys into one of the chicanes and making the corner, which Bayliss said, I said, Troy, like, how did you, he just got on the bike. He just got on Michelin's. He had no background to speak of with Michelin tires. And at the time it was Michelin's have more grip, but they're less communicative. So they let go, more surprisingly. But he just went in. I said, how'd you do that? And he's like, I reckon I just squeeze a bit harder, mate. I was like, okay, very nice answer, very laid back. But there he was. So that was the interview, the opportunity to interview Colin racing the RC51.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what do you like about it? And he's like, well, it doesn't try to kill me when I enter any corner as much as the RC45 did.
Yeah.
He said it would turn. It was much more willing to turn than the RC45 had been. And the important distinction also is 1000cc. So that was a really neat time. RC51 and Suzuki doing the TL1000. In AMA in the late 90s, Suzuki was showing up with, God, it seemed like 4,000cc V-twins and four 754s. Like, what do we do? What do we try? How's this going to turn out? Let's just keep messing around. It was beautiful to see all that investment.
Someone interviewed Mr. Yamanaka, who was associated with so many motorcycles, but VFR for sure, late in his career, and he said, it's hard to imagine the future since nearly everything has been tried. So it's interesting to relate that at the very end of the career of RC45, they decided to put the oil into the ends of the crankshaft. Prior to that, it was lubricating its connecting rods by bleeding oil off of the main bearings through drillings in the crankshaft. That meant that oil had to flow from outside the crankshaft radially inward against so-called centrifugal force. With RC45, which turned astronomical revolutions, the rod bearings were streaking black, just as they had always done with RC30. And they'd never had a complete failure, but it was like fate was in there with a dark magic marker making these lines to say, you guys don't know everything, do you?
Well, and how could you, if you're an engine builder, how could you live with that idea? You'd have to, like, yeah, you got to do something. We can't leave this.
So they tried 100 pounds of oil pressure, and no different. Black streaks.
And how much horsepower would that take? Oh, gosh.
So, okay, I said we will now adopt Formula One practice, which is end feed. And lots of motorcycle engines now have end feed. BMW has built them. Lots of people have built them. So they adopt end feed and they find all they need is 12 psi. Because now the oil is coming in at the center of the crankshaft and being flung outward to the connecting rod bearings on the crank pins. And Mr. Gary Mathers said, who was the always innovative and sometimes overly talkative director of American Honda Racing, he said the engines came with tags on them saying 12 psi oil pressure is all this engine needs. It is normal. This is not a problem, because everyone was so focused on, well, we've got to find a way to get more oil in there, and it's going to take more pressure. So it was interesting to learn from Mr. Ishikawa, LPL on the 2020 Fireblade, that they were, of course, that's 4 cylinders long. They're putting oil in both ends of the crankshaft. Formula One style, late model RC45 style. So you can't produce a line of engines of this kind without learning a great deal along the way. One of the early lessons was supposedly that an automated assembly system was pioneered by early VFRs. I don't know if this is the case or not, but for some reason, oil was very slow in reaching the very end of one of the camshafts. And I remember Paul Dean telling me that he timed it once at something like 7 minutes for oil pressure to reach after cold start. And all sorts of kits of external oil lines. And here's the modification. If you do this, you'll never have another trouble again. Honda had to scramble to correct this problem because it was a torpedo that was rushing toward the motorcycle engine that was supposed to be the tip of the spear of Honda's resurgence. Sit down, Yamaha. We're going to take the top box. And yeah, you have to work for supremacy. And I like to think of late night operations at HRC and other places where testing goes on. And I've talked to people who, the U.S. Superbike team would go to Japan and learn about the engine by building their own. And they said, even though we're in the last year of RC45 operations, that would be 98, I suppose, they were running tests of valve train components for that engine at night. So that means a lot of test facilities booked up.
Well,
So,
hands-on, it's how you get rid of frame error, like what you were talking about,
yeah,
where your reference is wrong. And so you have all this experience of engines that need 40, 50, 60 psi of oil pressure. And then you get this one and like, oh man, it's got 12 pounds. They must have screwed this up. Like, like, what do we do? And you go and you fix something, torque values, uh, little like clutch springs. I just recently had this experience with my XS 650. I did a clutch in my 72 Yamaha, and whoever put that together torqued the daylights out of those little, like, what are they, like the shanks, like 4 millimeter or something.
yeah,
Just
they're
those,
little.
the little bolts that hold the springs on. They're supposed to be 7 foot-pounds, roughly 7 to 9 foot-pounds, and whoever put those in there tightened them so much that it cracked the boss of the clutch. And you're just like, it's not an axle. And then actually it has a spring washer if we think about it. So it's just, you have this reference of the only things that you've experienced. And then you're confronted with
Something that violates that
something that
your
violates that,
rules.
your rules. And it's been tested. That's what's so great about finding the answers for yourself, taking things apart and looking at the bearings, taking measuring. It takes 7 seconds for the oil pressure to get to the end of that or 7 minutes to get to the end of that camshaft. Like visualizing it and saying, okay, well, where's the oil pump? How do we, can we put a light ball check valve to keep the oil from draining out of this? Like, how do we solve it? And actually measuring things. That's what's always driven me to take things apart, is that I have confidence in what I'm dealing with. Like I put it back together and I know for sure. It's like I know it's very mundane. The power steering pump on a 1989 Ford, it's a vane type pump. It's got a big plastic reservoir, and the rebuild kit's, like 6 O-rings and a shaft seal and a
Yeah,
few other bits. And if you have a quiet one, you don't trade that in for something that someone else has rebuilt. You rebuild it yourself.
yeah.
And you just figure it out, right? And then what you have. And that confidence is what I find necessary. And so it's neat that that fundamental to Honda's success, they're taking the team to build the engines. Like,
Yeah, themselves
yeah,
for
that's,
their team. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
the combustion chamber for RC30 was highly refined for its time. It was based on research. The RC45 combustion chamber was a step forward. When RC211V, the V5 MotoGP engine that Honda ran from 2002 to 2006, was based on RC45 combustion chambers. And one of these Japanese gentlemen said, we have invested a great deal of research in making something that works well. Why would we throw that away and start over again? Let's use something that we already have and have confidence in its performance. So,
Oh, that's the playbook over at Polaris, man. You get a combustion chamber that works and they stick it on everything, right? Like, you don't
yeah.
have to reinvent. And it's just, yeah, they've got like a million repetitions for this combustion chamber, and we know what it does. Let's put it over here. And
At one point, they put VTEC on VFR. And VTEC this particular VTEC, a variable valve timing system, involved having 3 cam lobes. And 2 of the cam lobes, the outer pair, operate the 2 valves at lower speeds. They may have staggered opening, which can produce axial swirl. If it starts to blow out of one, it's like when you play with the hose filling a bucket. You can make the water spin. Waiting for a bucket to fill is one of those experiences that you wouldn't want to repeat too often. So in order to while away the minutes, you play a game. And so those outer 2 lobes are designed to make the bottom end punchy and to boost intake velocity to improve cylinder filling when the engine is not on the boil. And then, depending on what year, the first ones switched over at 7,000, then it was 6,800, then it was 6,400. Suddenly, at some point in the operation, a pin is hydraulically shot through all three rocker arms, causing them to be operated by the center lobe, which is the high performance lobe. And this is one of those things like shift cam at BMW and other such inventions that when you have played out your ability to have it all strong off the bottom, good mid-range acceleration, breathtaking top speed, when you can't budge the compromise any further, throw the compromise out and have one cam profile for idle to 6,400 and another one for 6,400 onward. And certainly such a device takes engineering, but that's what Honda have always had. Then along comes the gray men of Brussels, implementing Euro 5 in January 1st, 2020, with a 1 year before new models that don't comply will be banned. So for 2021, Honda had to look at, are we going to keep making this? Where are we going to put the larger catalyst mufflers? How are we going to deal with sound? How are we going to make an antique design modern? Maybe that's not a good idea anymore. Let's let it go.
Well, it would cost a lot.
Yeah, it would cost a lot, and it was always costing more because two groups of two cylinders makes tooling more difficult rather than just having four in a row. And two cam drives, two of so many things. So 21, finito, end of story. But there's still so many what I would call VFR people who really enjoyed and continue to enjoy. My middle son has one, rides it all over the place. I think it's a 98. And that's quite an accomplishment to have a motorcycle that is still widely in service and is enjoyed and admired by many people. Good going, I say.
Yeah, it was its own kind of sub brand. It really established its own thing. It's like Goldwing. Goldwing evokes these ideas of riding to Yuma from LA and an easy ones. You're just there and you feel good when you get there, and you take all your stuff and you don't care, what happens to the weather. It's its own sub brand. VFR became its own sub brand. It took all of that World Supers glow and gear driven cams and single sided swing arm stuff, NACA ducks on the.
We know that Honda was introducing hot stuff that would compete with the sort of interceptor role, namely the 900RR and its subsequent descendants, which are inline fours. And these steps forward leave a classic design behind. So a new role has to be found for it, and that was the natural one of a kind of sport touring identity. And that's what it carried into the new century. And frankly, that's what it's mainly remembered for. But I also remember those hot days in the summer of 1983 when people were saying, where can I get an interceptor? I got to have one. Because for reasons unknown, American riders suddenly appreciated handling. Before that, they just ripped through the magazine, top speed, quarter mile time. That's the extent of a lot of people's knowledge about motorcycle, in quotes, progress.
But I think what, my observation is Kawasaki H2s. You just need one ride on a 75 Liberta 3CL, especially before they tip the shocks forward. 75 is the one that I owned. And I rode that bike in the 90s, 2000s. And it was terrifying. I mean, it was big, bulky, long, heavy steering. It handled okay. The suspension was very stiff. It had the S&W shocks on the back that were rock hard. And that goes back to the Alan Girdler quote of how you made suspension work in the 70s was by not letting it.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
locking it solid. And that thing just wallowed all over the place. It would drag stuff. It was fun to ride, but you had this big, heavy front wheel, iron discs, and it just everything took a lot of effort. And I think you had people who dealt with weave and wobble and worn out swing arm bushes on your, they use plastic swing arm bushes in XS 650s and RDs, and they're not tapered roller bearings in the headstock. And so you have all of these things adding up to engine performance has made great leaps. Handling is not there. And they've experienced it. They've ridden enough and said, like, yeah, wow, this thing, sure, it does an 11.2 in the quarter, but turn one, watch out.
Yeah.
So.
Well, when one of the riders that I work with, Nick Rakiki, made the transition from twins to the TZ750, he came in from practice and he said, I don't know how those guys are doing this. He said, I'm using all my strength to change direction, hauling on the bars. Well, it didn't surprise me years later when I learned that Ben Spies had bent the bars on some of his bikes. Because
that's the lore with Freddie too. Freddie on one of the 750s one of the 750s, tubular sit-up bikes that he was racing in the 80s. He bent the bars, 82, 81, something like that.
Yeah. So that business with a heavy front wheel, one of the bikes that my middle son bought on his way to the VFR was a CB900F, and the front wheel on that is so heavy. And then he happened to have a front wheel from a Kawasaki's 600 Super Sport bike. It's just such a difference. And even people that remember those old, heavy, and frankly terrible motorcycles of the deep past are impressed when they ride something that's easier to operate. And I think that the Interceptor showed people that it was possible for the motorcycle to obey, and to obey promptly and non-violently. Because what was happening at that time, Honda may have been trying to fight off Yamaha's challenge as part of the impetus for the VFRs, but at the same time, Interceptor in 1983 was the first big gun of the re-engineered sport bikes. Those big, heavy sit-up 1000s were terrible motorcycles for racing, and that's why they had to be so extensively re-engineered. Forks replaced, swing arm replaced, brakes replaced, everything different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think of Suzuki in 1984. You go to a Suzuki dealership. You go to a Suzuki dealership in 1984, and you had GS 1150 ES huge, more displacement, big air-cooled inline four, giant fairing with the big round headlight, looked like Bull Door 1979,
Yeah.
like a big endurance racer. And then you had an FWS 1000 or the BF 1000R sort of in the same period. That looked like the future, and the Suzuki was clearly the past. And Suzuki already knew that, because what did we get in 85? 85, 86, we got the GSXR 750.
Yeah.
And that was the return salvo to Interceptor. And then FZ750, which was sort of Yamaha's, wouldn't call it waking up, but it was certainly where we weren't thinking about shaft drive triples and stuff. We just dove right into how are we going to win.
Yeah.
It's like what BMW did when they decided to build a Superbike. They said, well, we got to do everything exactly how, like, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. That was what was so great about the BMW Superbike, was that they didn't reinvent the wheel. They didn't put their traditional thumb turn signals on. They didn't do anything alternative with the front end. They just like, hey, Showa, hey, Olins, hey, whoever. Yeah, let's make the fork tubes really big and give it a good fork with good damping. And that's what they did. And then they said, well, at the time that they were designing it, all the Japanese were like 150 horsepower, 155 horsepower, 160 horsepower, which is sort of where all the Japanese hit the brakes.
Yeah.
Like they haven't come out with a street production leader class bike that's 180, 190, 200. And BMW just came out of the gate, and from intake to exhaust, they just looked at how do we do this. They came out and they sort of, Ducati's certainly there building those exotics. But anyway, just to be able to say, like, we're going to build a Superbike. And
that historic period, I think of being in Cycle World's rented little room at the big show in Europe. And David Edwards, who was in your chair at that time, editor-in-chief, and he looked around at all this and he said, what are we going to call this? And nobody was saying anything. So I thought, how about Europe takes the lead? Because that's what was happening. The Europeans weren't scared, as the Japanese were, by the liability implications of electronic rider aids. They pioneered stuff and they called it what it was, while the Japanese were still, maybe need special language for this. And
I had one manufacturer say, it's not traction control, but it's all about maintaining traction.
Yes, very good. Very good. Outstanding, in fact.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, it was a strange time. And also, they didn't have if you look at somebody like Honda, how many millions of square feet of motorcycle production factory do they maintain around the world? And what volumes are they dealing with? And so if you're a European manufacturer, your ability to say, like, yeah, we can make a good margin on 5,000 of these units, or 3,000. What's viable? They could make those smaller decisions. I think what BMW's sort of 220,000, I think, units annually. So we've seen
and they're completely unembarrassed to offer a scooter for $13,000. And maybe somebody bought them too. I don't know. I'd be curious. But of course, that is a different market.
Yeah.
Europe is no longer riding to work on a Solex or a Kreidler. People get to work somehow, but not that way. So it's a premium market. And the Europeans have gone after it in the U.S. in a very methodical way. Who has the money? Who's willing to spend it on this? Let's get them. And the Japanese had their greatest experience in mass market motorcycling. And that's, I won't say that's finished, but it is weakened in the U.S. I remember a fellow came into our dealership, and this would be like 1970. And he said, well, I just lost my job, so I'm going to buy a bike. Because he had every confidence. It wasn't going to be the terrible 2008. Things go down, they come back. Confidence in America. And it was good to see. We were glad to sell him a motorcycle, even if he didn't have a job, because he soon would have. So there's been a shift in the market toward premium products in the Western nations. Meanwhile, the big, gigantic market is in Asia and Southeast Asia. And that's where the action is.
Oh, yeah. Brazil and India.
Yeah.
You know, much larger middle class in India than 20 years ago.
Mm.
And Royal Enfield is there with an affordable line of motorcycles. But I guess, you know, one of the sad notes that we'll finish this podcast with was, I have it on good authority that there was a 5-cylinder, a V5 street bike that was in the works and far along that was ultimately killed because our appetite for that kind of, we did finally get the RC213B, the V4 version, which was very cool. And it was very Honda in the sense that, oh, by the way, it's 100 horsepower.
Yes.
Unless
Unbelievable.
unless you get these special parts, which you can't get in the States because it's not legal, and we can't. And then you know, that was a very, very Honda way of going about it.
That was 2015, something like that. I went to see that thing. It was very beautiful. It was wonderfully finished.
Oh, exquisite. Yep. And it had it all, you know, it had all the potential, but they're very compliant. Let's say they take all of the rules very seriously. You know, the sound limits. I mean, a BMW S1000RR, when those first came out, they were loud. We were doing Superbike testing, and the Yamaha R1 would go by and it'd go whoosh.
Yep.
And then the BMW go by and go, bah! And it's like, huh. And they just, you know, BMW was like, we'll get right up on the limit. And there were margins, you know, they were maintaining margins, and then the life of the motorcycle, how loud does it get over time, and what's the warranty? And they were real serious about it, where the fender is relative to the rear wheel, the width of the turn signals, everything was pitch perfect. And a lot of European manufacturers were a little more cowboy about that stuff, although their volumes have gone up, so have the penalties.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening, folks. Kevin says something. He's ready. Yeah.
No, I was making a face.
Okay. Thanks for listening, folks. We'll thank Octane Lending for being our sponsor. Click the link in description. Go check out a new bike and see what you qualify for. It's quick and easy, and it helps support us. So please check it out. We will catch you next time. Thanks so much.